السيدات والسادة.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello again, and may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you. Of course, we all know that the sessions after lunch are sessions that are very difficult. So in this session there are groups of experts who will be talking about the US-Iranian tensions and the repercussions on Gulf security. As a chairman of the session, please let me talk about some introductions, some general ideas before we delve into more and more details. There is no doubt that US-Iranian tensions in the Gulf is something that is not new. This is something that goes back to even before the existence of the Gulf and before we even start talking about this linkage. And if we want to put this within a framework today, it's very important to talk about this relation that emanated between the United States of America and the current Iranian regime. We noticed in the different decades that came after the establishment in Iran, how much the situation has changed. And today, of course, the situation is a little bit different in comparison with what it was in the past. We were talking about the possibility of a military intervention. However, today the situation is a little bit calmer. The United States of America does not want to confront Iran. But what does all of this mean to us here in the Gulf? So there are a lot of military and political confrontations that are affected essentially by this relation between the US and Iran. There are three main questions about what is happening today. The first is the following: what's the nature of the relation between Iran and Russia, if you take into consideration the competition between the US and Russia? The second thing is the following: what are the capacities of Iran today politically and economically to face any military, economic or political issue or difficulty? And the third question is the following: can we say that there is the presence of Gulf states in this equation, or is it just a proxy of the Iranian power? So these are different questions. We will start first and foremost with Dr. Mehran Kamrava, professor and director of the Center for International and Regional Studies at Georgetown University in Qatar. He holds a PhD from Cambridge University. He is the author of a number of studies on the Gulf, most recently inside the Arab state troubled waters. Today Dr. Kamrava will be talking about Iran and the United States, neither peace nor war. I won't take any extra time. I would like to give the floor now to Mr. Mehran Kamrava. You have 15 to 20 minutes as a maximum.
Thank you, Dr. Majed. I appreciate it. Good afternoon. I apologize for not giving this presentation in Arabic. I'll be presenting it in English, and for that I apologize. The topic of US-Iran relations is something about which many volumes of books have been written, and we can sit here and talk for many, many hours. But I'll try and condense it in very brief presentation. This is a history, of course, as we know, that dates back 40 years. And it is a history that is punctuated with bad blood and, in many ways, a visceral dislike of people in Iran towards the United States and people in the United States towards Iran. If you look at popular culture, for example, emanating from the US, even in American popular culture, Iran is oftentimes the villain. But this is tension that is rooted in fundamentally different conceptions of the international order. It's a fundamentally different conceptions of the international order, particularly as it translates to the Middle East region and to the Arabian Peninsula in particular. And of course, this tension, despite its history of 40 years, it has had many dimensions, but really it goes back to the core of a strategic competition between these two powers. Despite the rhetoric that surrounds the tension between Iran and the United States, it's a competition that is rooted in strategy and different strategic objectives rather than ideology. And of course, we know that there have been different levels of intensity to this relationship. Towards the end of the Obama administration, we thought maybe there was an opening between Iran and the United States, and that culminated in the signing of the nuclear accord. And of course, now we see once again a heightening of those tensions. Interestingly, if you go back to the Clinton administration, again, there was a relative comparative lessening of tensions. Those tensions reached a high pitch during the George Bush administration, and then the Obama administration, and now. This latest episode of tensions that is at a high pitch has been exacerbated by a number of reinforcing developments. First and foremost, we have in the Middle East after 2011 a proliferation of weak states. These weak states have enabled activity and activism by non-state actors, and they have intensified regional competition by powers that I will talk about in a minute. And of course, we have in Iran a post-revolutionary state, which is a state that engages in populist politics, and with the coming to office of Donald Trump, we have a ratcheting up of populist politics and populist rhetoric in the United States. So in many ways, we have now, since 2017, 2016, a battle of populisms, both Iranian populism and American populism. And of course, since 2015, we have seen a much more assertive foreign policy coming out of Riyadh. And so the Saudi assertiveness has increased tensions and added to these tensions, both the foreign policy objective coming from Iran and, of course, coming from the United States. Now, these two powers, Iran and the United States, have conflicting priorities, particularly when it comes to this region. They have different conceptions of their own roles regionally and globally. Regionally and globally. The United States, of course, sees itself as a global superpower and therefore as the rightful architect of regional orders in the Middle East as well as elsewhere. It wants to shape the region and regional security architectures in ways that support its foreign policy objectives. When it comes to this part of the world, it sees itself as an offshore balancer. It sees itself as someone that can enable parties that have foreign policy objectives similar to its own. It is an external security provider for for the GCC states, and of course it's got regional allies. It's got regional allies throughout the Gulf region, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, Oman. And of course, throughout, what we see is that the GCC in particular, they see themselves as dependent on provision of American security. So by default, the GCC finds itself as an integral part of Iran-US tensions. It plays by default, whether or not it likes it, it plays an important role in that relationship. Now, Iran, of course, has its own priorities. It sees itself as a global middle power and as a regional superpower. Its self-conception is fundamentally different from the United States, and therefore its policy priorities are fundamentally different. It sees itself as a counter-hegemonic actor. It says that the United States and its allies are sources of American hegemony, and Iran perceives of itself as a counter-hegemonic actor. And because of its revolutionary history, because of its profile, it has cultivated ties with regional non-state actors, because it has been unable to cultivate ties with regional state actors. Therefore, it cultivates ties with regional non-state actors. And of course, after 2011 and the proliferation of weak states, that has provided for it a golden window of opportunity to give substance to its relationship with non-regional actors. Now, these conflicting priorities have significant repercussions for the Middle East in general and for the Arabian Peninsula in particular. Let's spend a minute looking at the regional order and how the current regional order in the Middle East plays into and reinforces the conflict and the tensions between the United States and Iran. In many ways, currently the regional hierarchy represents a pyramid. This pyramid has at its point Iran and Turkey on the one side, both of whom consider themselves as counter-hegemonic actors, counter-hegemonic states, and two other regional superpowers or global middle powers that see themselves as bastions of the American engineered status quo, Israel and Saudi Arabia. And then in the Middle East, we have a series of regional middle powers. These are powers within the region that occupy not necessarily the position of regional superpowers, but regional middle powers. Countries like Algeria, Morocco, Oman, Qatar, Turkey, Tunisia. And these are also states that have been very pragmatic and have pursued a very pragmatic foreign policy. And then on the other side, we have states that have been supporters of the regional status quo, this American engineered status quo, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Egypt, and Jordan. Now, I should say, by the way, it's easy to place these countries in categories on a whiteboard or on a PowerPoint presentation, but these are categories that are extremely fluid and dynamic, and they change according to different times. Also, of course, there are times when regional superpowers take a back seat. They don't necessarily play the role of a superpower. They become, or they relegate themselves on purpose to middle power status. What happens is that because of a proliferation of weak states, because we have now, particularly after 2011, a number of states in which central authorities cannot exert full control over the actors or the borders under their purview, this has provided an opportunity for countries like Iran, the United States, Turkey, and Israel and Saudi Arabia to use these weak states as arenas of influence, to use these weak states as arenas, places like Syria, places like Lebanon, places like Libya, as arenas in which they compete and they contend with themselves. I'm a little reluctant to talk about Yemen because you might know that yesterday the American ambassador Brian Hook came out and said the Houthis are not supported by Iran, which was kind of a surprising statement to be made by members of the Trump administration. Now, how does this translate into what we see in our region? Well, despite the tensions, despite conflicting priorities, despite this very complex and fluid regional order, I think between Iran and the United States, war is unlikely. We have what you might call is a balance of fear. Now, why is war unlikely? For a variety of reasons. First of all, what we have is, at least by the American president, if not by many of his deputies, is a certain sense of war weariness. President Trump doesn't seem to want to be engaged in the same kind of unending conflict that George Bush brought on for the United States in relation to Iraq. And the Iraq experience reminded us once again that even a superpower cannot necessarily win a war against the middle power. Doesn't matter who the middle power is. You might be able to force military defeat, but you cannot win the war. You might win the battle, but not the war. And so the Iraq experience continues to be alive on many policymakers' minds. But we also need to be mindful of the strategic pragmatism that has characterized Iranian conduct in relation to the United States and in relation to the rest of the region. How about the Iranians? Well, this tells us about the American perspective. The Iranians, for their own part, don't mind continued tensions coming from Tehran. The Iranians are unwilling, and I'll tell you why, although they want to continue to reduce tensions, but their policies in real life will continue to have keep tensions high. The Iranians are unwilling to let their regional allies go. They're the only friends they have in many cases. They have been a source of power projection, and they're unwilling to let them go. And Supreme Leader Khamenei has said that Syria is Iran's strategic depth. This is a term he used, not me. So they're unwilling to let go, and of course, that is likely to continue to have consequences. But it's not just Iran and the United States, it's other actors as well. It's the possibility of preemptive strike by Israel as well. It is also the fact that every other week we hear out of Tel Aviv the fact that all cards are on the table, all options are on the table. And of course, it's not just Israel, it's Israel's unofficial allies. It's Saudi Arabia and the UAE as well. And the fact that now we have this anti-Iran triangle that has emerged and is quite robust and quite active. Now, let me end with a couple of notes about implications for the Gulf Cooperation Council. What does all of this mean for the Gulf Cooperation Council? Well, I use this, of course, I don't need to remind us that right now the GCC is on life support. And we might be seeing some reduction of tensions with yesterday's statement by His Excellency, the Qatari Foreign Minister. But for all intents and purposes, for the last couple of years, the GCC has not necessarily been able to act with its intended purpose. The GCC itself has been divided in its relationship towards Iran and the United States among those countries that you might argue have pursued a much more pragmatic, less ideological foreign policy. Countries like Oman, whose foreign minister was in Iran this week and had got a message from the Iranian president saying Iran is willing to negotiate with Saudi Arabia with no conditions. Countries like Qatar that have also conducted themselves with pragmatism and a measure of realism, and of course, Kuwait. And at the same time, we have a group within the GCC that you might call the rejectionists. Somehow Iran is this source of allergy for them, and they don't necessarily want to talk to Iran despite Iranian overtures. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, despite UAE's security mission to Tehran, and of course Bahrain, and the relationship there is complicated by other factors. Now, it's not just the GCC, of course. Remember that the United States plays the role of an offshore balancer, and as we heard earlier by Mr. Parker, many countries in the GCC either engage in hedging or in bandwagoning. And we know that there are hazards inherent in bandwagoning. Those hazards are entrapment. For example, if Iran and the United States go into war, suddenly the GCC finds itself to be the main theater of battle. You know that the drone that the Iranians shot down, interestingly, that drone was not flown out of Al-Udeid. But because the Americans wanted to protect Qatar, they flew it out of a base in the UAE. And then, of course, we saw when the Iranians shot it down, the Emiratis sent a security delegation. But the fact that the GCC overall, by the way, the other side of, the other danger of bandwagoning is what many states in the region felt in 2015, and that's abandonment. If your main protector acts as if it's going to abandon you. And many states wrongly felt that the United States was going to abandon them, despite the fact that there was this increase in military-to-military relations, spike in arms sales, and all sorts of other deep-rooted relationships between the United States and the GCC. Nevertheless, this security dependence on the United States is an underlying source of worry and tension for the GCC when it comes to US-Iran relations. Let me end with a glimmer of hope, a glimmer of positivity, if there is any hope, and that is the actual Hope Initiative that we heard from President Rouhani. Hormuz Peace Endeavor, HOPE. And this is a peace initiative that at least is on the table. The rhetoric is there. Realistically, I don't think it's going to have any legs. Realistically, I cannot imagine the Saudis and the Emiratis seeing any benefit to engaging with Iran and seeing Iran, helping Iran out of its regional isolation. But at least the rhetoric and the option is there. Whether or not the regional actors go for it or some other iteration of it is yet to be seen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mehran. You spoke about the conflicts between US and Iran, the priorities of each of the parties, in addition to the regional system and regime in the Gulf, and the balance of fear and the applications on the Gulf. Now let's move to Mr. Mahjoob Zweiri. Mr. Mahjoob Zweiri is the director of the Center for Gulf Studies and associate professor of Middle Eastern Contemporary History at the University of Qatar. He was head of Department of Universities at the same university, and he was a professor of Islamic Studies program at the Center of Strategic Studies at the Jordanian University. He worked as a research fellow at and then director of the Center for Iranian Studies at the University of Durham, and he's the author of numerous studies and books on Iran and the Gulf. Today he will be talking about the US-Iranian crisis and its implications for the Gulf. You may take the floor. You have 15 to 20 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Majed. I would like to extend my deepest thanks and appreciation to the people from the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. This paper that I'm presenting was written thanks to a study that I made with Yasser Suleiman, a PhD student in what concerns Gulf studies. This study actually focuses on an essential idea. It is the following: how can we understand the US-Iranian crisis, the new one that started in the year 2018 when the Americans withdrew from the nuclear agreement? In order to understand this crisis in reality, of course, we should say that there has been a big crisis between Washington and Tehran even before the regime of the Islamic Republic in Iran. But what are the characteristics of this crisis? This crisis happened after a big turn in the US-Iranian relation, the signature of the nuclear agreement. What did this mean? I can understand that this agreement meant a change in the regional system or a regime in the Middle East through the re-identification of Iran from an isolated country playing negative roles to a country negotiating with the 5+1 and reaching a nuclear agreement for around 2 decades. So this agreement is like a rehabilitation of Iran on the political level and also also on the regional level and global level. What did this mean? It meant that the current situation or the status quo that was there before the year 2015 is now witnessing lots of changes in what concerns Iran. So all of those who used to look at Iran with animosity have to review their calculations and to play differently with this state that was able to reach an agreement with superpowers in the most important topic, the nuclear cause. The second thing that should be taken into account in this framework is the following. This agreement should be made with the presence of the United States of America. So the presence of the US in the agreement was a main condition for Tehran, because Tehran in the year 2005, when the Europeans proposed an initiative to them, Iran refused and said that we cannot reach an agreement without the presence of Washington. So when the Americans withdrew from the nuclear arrangement and agreement, this means that cards are being mixed once again, and that Iran is going back to the circle of isolation. And from here we look, or actually I look at this withdrawal as a step taken in order to go back to the situation that Iran was aiming to finish from, especially after the labor of the Arab Spring and after having witnessed lots of transformations here in the Arab region. So this also reflects a very important issue to us. The withdrawal process meant something. It was based on new alliances defined by the American administration. This administration started using an aggressive rhetoric towards Iran, and based on the aforementioned, it was trying to say the following: to whomever agrees with me, I am here. This was Trump's message when he was a candidate, and from here we found the KSA and UAE really seeking to contact this candidate and starting to talk to him about how to put an end to this danger that is considered a nuclear arrangement, and that was signed by the previous President Barack Obama. If we focus on the regional aspect and we look at this crisis was created by the political scene in America, and it is the result of the positions of two presidents. A president who thought that the US should change the rules of the game in the Middle East and not depend on non-active players in the region like KSA, and focus on other players who may have a more important role for the US. So of course this took a lot of time in the administration of Barack Obama and helped reach an agreement. President Trump is very different. President Trump does not believe in the idea of listening to others, and what's more dangerous is that he built his convictions on the following: that everything that was said by Barack Obama is devilish and I refuse it and I do not want to continue it. Like medical insurance in the US, everything that is environmental, all of these things are not considered important to President Trump. And the nuclear agreement comes within this circle. Now what about the withdrawal process? What about the implications of the withdrawal process and the interactions? All of these things help us understand why the Gulf crisis happened at the time that was closer to the American withdrawal. So the Americans wanted for the rules of the game to go back to before the year 2015. So this means that I want from KSA, from Egypt, to play a more important role, from countries like Iran to face sanctions, to not be able to export its oil. So it's like we are returning the situation to what was prominent in the past, and Iran was facing a very big crisis.
All of this happened at a time where there was not a major agreement or consensus that the Trump's moves were acceptable. The EU was not on board with President Trump. They agreed that the nuclear deal did not cover Iran's ballistic missiles, but the Europeans also disagreed on the withdrawal. And as we are seeing now, Iran is gradually scaling down its commitment, and it's also going to the pre-June 2015 status quo, and it's liberating itself of all the agreements it has conceded to. How did this impact the region and reflect on the region? The region has witnessed repositionment. For instance, if I'm talking about the GCC is supposed to be a regional entity that was established to deter the Iranian threat. Now the GCC is divided on how to deal with Iran. In the worst crisis since 1980, the GCC finds itself at a loss. Iran is being targeted 3 times or attacked 3 times. So the withdrawal is not distinct from the crisis. The withdrawal is not different or is linked to returning to the pre-2015 status quo, and it's not distanced from rearranging the situation in the Gulf and in the Middle East at large. So they are trying to reshape how to address the vulnerable countries. As a matter of fact, all of these countries have a role to play in the region, and if the pre-2015 status quo is restored, in this case the US will regain its role, Saudi Arabia will play a greater role, Iran's allies will have a lesser role to play, and this will also affect, for instance, Qatar, which has good relations with Iran, and these relations have been in place since 20 years. So this is linked to the details and the specifics of the 2017 Gulf crisis. Within this framework also, we should point out another element and factor. When the US withdrew from the nuclear deal, it realized that it had a problematic approach with Iran, so it cannot really become the the outright enemy of Iran. So we noticed there was changes in the positions of some countries. The United States of America went to the Warsaw country, 60 countries against Iran, and they said that this would lead to an alliance against Iran. Less than 45 days later, Saudi Arabia spoke positively about Iran. A UAE delegation visited Iran and discussed a security agreement. They also discussed a border agreement. So what did the value of the US withdrawal from the deal? Actually, by withdrawing from the deal, the US wanted to turn Iran into a pariah state, but still we saw some Gulf countries opening up to Iran. So the impact of the withdrawal appeared and manifested itself in the region when Saudi Arabia opened up, at least not officially, to Iran, and now we hear the MBS speaking more positively of Iran, so we had similar such overtures. The reason behind this change, of course, the war of tankers, the drones. In other words, for the first time, we could see the important role of the ghost non-government players. So in my opinion, the crisis has entered into what I call as the war of ghosts. This is the case of the cyber attacks. All parties are infiltrating the networks of others, all are spying on others, but no one is admitting it. And this is another form of the war. So we have the war of drones. No one can tell that it was Iran or any other party behind this war. There are different accusations. All parties are trading blame, but there's no conclusive evidence. This has created deterrence and new rules of the game, and as proof, Iran and Saudi Arabia and the UAE have adopted and changed their approach to Iran. More importantly, the US administration's rhetoric also changed significantly. The president spoke about the US history, We had visits to Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia with statements that the war is not an option. So the whole strategy of restoring the pre-2015 status quo, which could have been achieved from the withdrawal from the agreement, is now at risk of total collapse. And in practical terms, the US strategy linking the US strategy on Iran is being tested today. As we know, the European Union trade agreement, actually there were 3 agreements part of INSTEX, and now there are now 9 European countries ready to cooperate with Iran commercially. We are talking about 400,000 barrels of Iranian oil that are exported in one way or another in the market. So the US has failed in achieving the objectives it set after withdrawing from the nuclear deal. What are the repercussions on the Gulf crisis? Depicting Iran as an enemy and trying also to create fronts within the GCC are also bumping into obstacles. Kuwait has good relations with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE rearranged their ties with Iran. As for Bahrain, as His Excellency the Foreign Minister said, we cannot comment on Bahrain's position. So in other words, we are seeing a major turnaround, a major shift in the US strategy regarding the Gulf crisis and the withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear deal. In a nutshell, there is a serious talk that the Gulf crisis will witness a détente or there will be positive changes. If this happens, there will be changes to the perception of Iran, which will no longer be seen as the root cause of all the problems in the Gulf. In other words, the Iranian nuclear deal and the US withdrawal and also the ongoing attempts to restore the pre-2015 status quo in the region are all facing a major test. We will have to wait and see how Iran will be able to economically counter and these tests. If Iran manages to overcome these US tests and the successive sanctions, and if Iran manages to counter the US pressure, then I believe that Trump's withdrawal from the nuclear deal would have backfired, and I'm not sure if this strategy will be successful. This keeps the question open to what extent the Europeans will be able to impose new rules of the game in dealing with Iran. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mahjoob. You provided a historical overview about the US-Iranian relations, and you also highlighted the role between the two parties, the ups and downs of the relationship between Iran and the US and other players, and you also discussed the repercussions and the implications for the Gulf and also potential future scenarios. Last but not least, I will give the floor to Dr. Ali Fathollah-Nejad. He is a professor and director of the Center for International and Regional Studies at Georgetown University, Qatar. He is at Harvard, and he will soon publish a book, Iran, in the new order. Dr. Ali will speak today about Iran and the US-Iranian strategy after withdrawal from the nuclear deal. You have 15 to 20 minutes.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very delighted to be here. Also, thank you so much for the promotion. And thank you, Mehran, that I was just announced to be your successor, it seems. So very delighted. Also, I'm very happy about my professorship as well. So it seems there were some, mistakes or editing mistakes in both the abstract and in my bio in the program. So I don't have a PhD from Cambridge, but from SOAS, and I'm a visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center here in Doha. Anyways,
So I'm very delighted to be on the panel with, two people for whom I have much respect, Mahjoob and Kamran, who fortunately said everything, so I'm going to keep my presentation to 30 seconds. No, so basically, my task is to talk a bit about Iranian strategy that was, of course, mentioned also briefly in Mahjoob's intervention here. So, as you know, after the US unilateral withdrawal from the JCPOA in May 2018, Iran announced to respond to that de facto violation of the JCPOA, but by what it called a maximum pressure, a maximum resistance strategy. And although the term suggests that there are more there are only offensive elements, it is true that offensive elements did indeed dominate, but they were also complemented by some defensive components. So perhaps a few words at the beginning on Iranian foreign policy in the region. Normally, and we have two schools of thought in Tehran when it comes to Iran's regional policy. One that can be termed the offensive realists, and the other one that can be termed the defensive realists. So basically, the offensive realists were very much at the helm of Iranian foreign policy during the Ahmadinejad era. And their kind of strategy was deemed to be successful in the wake of the US neoconservative wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So to consider actually offense as the best kind of defense. And the offensive realist school is also predicated upon a zero-sum game. So that is, the more our foes lose, we in turn might gain from that. Whereas, and then the main agents and actors of this offensive realist school are obviously the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, but also the so-called Office of the Supreme Leader of Iran, who basically dominate Iran's regional policies. On the other hand, we have the defensive realist school that is very much reflected in the foreign ministry, but also in the Rouhani administration, and which believe in a win-win scenario, something that has been reflected in the JCPOA, and which also very stark difference between the two, because I'm going to later on talk about Iran's look to the east revitalization policy, is a different appreciation of US power. So while the offensive realist school thinks that the US is in some kind of an ultimate decline, the defensive realist school is much more cautious about that, but I'm going to talk more about it later on. So basically, this Iranian response to the maximum pressure strategy, coined maximum resistance, was indeed a kind of elite consensus. So both schools basically agreed to pursue this path, and despite the reality of a kind of Janus-faced Iranian foreign policy, at the end of the day, I think the right hand knows what the left hand does. And so this elite consensus is also embodied in the Supreme National Security Council, a kind of American NSC, where the representatives of both schools are there. So this Iranian strategy after the US JCPOA withdrawal contained was directed vis-a-vis three actors in particular. One vis-a-vis the United States, somehow directly or indirectly, and its allies in the region. Two vis-a-vis Europe, and three vis-a-vis Asia. So talking about the offensive measures of this strategy, it contained one, a gradual reduction of Iran's JCPOA commitments over a 1.5-year period, with all steps being modest and therefore reversible. And two, a series of well-calibrated, although officially denied, acts of destabilization in the wider Gulf region over the spring and summer of this year, facilitated by Iranian expectations of Trump opposed to military escalation, as Kamran said, and also war, given also his re-election chances in the United States. These two measures by the Iranians have pursued a dual aim. A, to increase pressure on Europe to fulfilling its INSTEX promises, so this kind of parallel financial channel that the Europeans somehow set up, as to avoid the nuclear crisis to reemerge. B, to reestablish Iran's bargaining leverage it enjoyed before the JCPOA negotiation process had started, which had effectively offered the international community the meager choice between two evils of an Iranian bomb or of bombing Iran, so that it can exit Iran from its position of weakness before entering into talks with the United States. And talks with the United States sooner or later are indispensable because of the heavy weight that the US sanctions are having on not only Iran's economy, but also overshadowing much of its relations with Europe, but also with Asia. The third element was to signal to all adversaries of Iran in the region the heavy costs of war on Iran. So including internationalizing the conflict by showcasing the volatility of energy security in the Gulf, and sandwiching Saudi Arabia by targeting it from the north and the south, thus exposing its vulnerabilities. I think, all the different elements of this strategy are well known. The defensive component included one, a reiteration of Iran's basic adherence to the JCPOA, and two, testing the waters of possible negotiations with the United States. Because although, and this, for example, can be evidenced by the April 2019 visit of Iran's foreign minister to the United States and his offer of a prisoner swap. So although, Iran was officially denying any willingness to engage with the United States and saying that only engagement makes sense if the United States totally, stops the sanctions. At the same time, they were testing the waters because of the realization that the Iranians know that sooner or later they have to seek an arrangement with the United States, because those are those who decide on the sanctions issue and no one else. When it comes, now, a few comments on all of that. When it comes to Iran's European strategy, I think this was predicated upon European diplomatic and political support that Iran was given in the context of the JCPOA or after the conclusion of it. Nevertheless, I think this realization somehow came to the Iranians, but quite late. It was quite naive to really bank on the Europeans and to really expect that the Europeans might be really challenging the United States, and that the instrument that they set up called INSTEX might be working. And although, even Supreme Leader Khamenei, who is more, part of that school that looks more to the east than to the west, he was nevertheless also supporting this kind of, also outlook or European strategy. But this European strategy did not work in the sense that Europe was able to deliver on its promises of providing Iran with the economic dividends. On the other hand, it has worked to some extent in the sense that, and as we can see very recently, the Iranians were able to scare the Europeans in a sense that despite their gradual reduction of commitments, which was not, really welcomed by the Europeans, but nevertheless, the Europeans try not to escalate, right? So they try to keep the JCPOA on some kind of life support, if you will, and to continue this path, although they were not happy with, some Iranian steps and also parts of Iranian escalation strategy in the Gulf. But up until now, it has worked. I'm not sure about the future because in Europe we have two camps vis-à-vis Iran. One that is heavily invested in the JCPOA, that regards Iran's regional role to be more positive than other powers' regional roles, notably that of Saudi Arabia. Very much embodied in, Mogherini's stance, for example. But you have another camp that is more concerned about the malign or the negative aspects of Iranian policy in the region when it comes to its interference in some Arab countries, its ballistic missile program, and so forth. And so the possibility remains that if Iran continues, or if the next step, let's say, of the gradual reduction of commitments under the JCPOA will be as harsh as the Iranians have communicated recently over the past few weeks to the Europeans to kind of scare them off, that they might, for example, go, have a considerable increase of the enrichment level. So if this happens, maybe there's going to be a different balance of power within those two camps inside of Europe, plus the fact that there might be some other elements that play into this kind of balance that have to do with Iran's domestic politics and also the protests in the region. But for now, also Mogherini's successor has been, having the same line as his predecessor. So this on the European side. On the Asian, on the look to the east, so basically if you look back to the first decade of the 2000s, during the Ahmadinejad years, where you had this kind of Iran's proclamation of a look to the east policy, this came precisely at a time when Iran was dissatisfied and frustrated over Europe. Because of that factor, Iran was, proclaiming the look to the east, which is basically having closer ties with Asian great powers as a kind of counterbalance US pressure against the backdrop of Europe not being able or willing to do so. So now, this revitalization of the look to the east policy of Tehran has the same reasons. And its frustration over European role. And interestingly, this new proclamation of the look to the east policy preceded the US unilateral withdrawal of May 2018. It came in February 2018, basically, officially proclaimed at least. But by that time already, there was some frustration in Tehran over the lack, over Europe's inability or unwillingness to provide for the economic benefits of the deal, because European major companies were, of course, not engaging in trade because of the threat of US sanctions, be with us or against us. Otherwise, we're going to cut your access to the US market and financial system. So the look to the east policy, although it has some considerations and is underpinned by some aspects that might be quite forceful if you look at them, at the end of the day, you cannot consider that to be a successful strategy. It is predicated upon material interests. So basically, it argues that because of the nexus that exists between Western and Eastern Asia. There is a material foundation of it, Iran being a major oil exporter, East Asian powers being major energy importers. So this is quite clear. The camp that is supporting this kind of strategy has also some political interests involved with that as well, because they regard those East Asian relations to be less problematic, because unlike the West, the Eastern powers are not going to talk about human rights and other issues of governance, for example. So there is a political element to that as well. And it's very much supported by the offensive realist school that thinks that US decline is something, very much forceful, and what we see is a de facto emergence of a truly multipolar world order. Well, you have an increasingly multipolar world order, but the very efficiency of the US sanctions regime then and now, just tells you how powerful the United States still is, and how overshadowing its sanctions policy is on various aspects of Iran's international relations. Whereas the defensive realist school in Iran has a much better sense of the international realities. It doesn't deny the fact that the US is in relative decline, but even though it argues that in this situation the US can be very detrimental to Iran. So it has a much more realistic account of that. But so at the end of the day, what Iran needs to do in order to really benefit from all those kinds of various trends of its international relations is to do something with the removal of US sanctions. Because only the removal of US sanctions can open Iran's way to fully benefit from its European ties, but also from its Asian ties. If it does not happen, then it's going to be in a state as we have seen now and also in the recent past. Thank you.
شكرا دكتور علي، وشكرا لجميع المتحدثين على التزامهم.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, and thank you to all speakers. Now we would like to open the floor for the Q&A session. We can hear 3 at a time, and then we hear from the Tribune. Let's start from the right. Hussein Sama, I'm a researcher from Kuwait. I have 2 main points that I would like to mention. I hope the answers will be 1. The first point is addressed, or the question is addressed to Dr. Mehran. It's related to the no peace, no war. So can this be applied to cases different than that of Iran and the United States of America? The other question is the following. Maybe it has the same answer. Would it be possible to compare the no peace, no war between Iran and the US to something similar in the Middle East? There are we can talk about also the cases with Israel, even the last wars. So can we say that this is a phenomenon that is related to the Middle East? I have also a third question that I would like to address, and please, this is your last question. Anyone can answer this question. How can we put an end, or how can the Iranian popularism and might this have a relation with the fact that Iran might or should put an end to the revolution, because this will put an end to what I'm talking about? Thank you. Sido Al-Kuwari, my question is addressed to Dr. Majed Al-Ansari and to Dr. Mahjoob, but I am not a speaker. I would like to benefit from this opportunity and address a question to you. Do the GCC countries require a strategy, a new strategy? knowing that there are reports by the CIA that there is a movement that is not justified to be a nuclear force. However, it is probable for it to be a nuclear force. Thank you, Dr. Rashid. Kindly use the microphone. Thank you, Dr. Majed. Thank you to all speakers. Actually, Iran in the region, we cannot change this fact because geographically it is here in the region. We heard a lot about the problems here in Iran or in the region as a whole. What are the solutions? What are the roles of research centers in order for decision makers to formulate solutions that can reinforce coexistence in the region? Now we'll move to Dr. Abdullah Al-Shaji and we'll move to the Tribune.
Oh, sorry. It's Professor Ali. No, I'm just kidding. So on the issue of the dual nationals, I mean, it's very good news. I think so he was a PhD student from Princeton. And as you know, I mean, the issue of dual nationals, so there are a few dual nationals who are detained. I mean, this case is not a dual national, of course, but it's similar to the cases of dual nationals detained by Iran who are used as bargaining chips vis-a-vis the countries of their origin, basically. So it has, you know, it concerns kind of bilateral issues between Iran and, let's say, England or Australia and other issues. So this is, but I'm not sure if, I mean, this is, you know, long-standing. It's nothing new, and it has also nothing to do with Iran's strategy after the JCPOA withdrawal. So I don't know if there was any other question addressed to me. Okay.
دكتور محجوب.
Dr. Mahjoob, الكلمة لك. I would like to start talking about the Iranian popularism. If we are talking about how popular Iran is, I think that the popularity of Iran since the year 2011 has been decreasing at the level of the Arab and Islamic public opinion, because all opinion polls, and I think that some of our colleagues might know this, all opinion polls show that there has been a decrease in what concerns looking at Iran in a positive manner, especially after its opinion regarding the Arab Spring, and if we take into consideration what is happening in Tunisia, what is happening in Syria, and so on. Of course, the position of Iran regarding the Arab Spring as an ethical question. This political regime is seeking, or was seeking, to put an end to the oppressed, and the only difference is that in Iran there was no other revolution. However, in the Arab countries we can talk about another revolution, and Iran is part of this system, and therefore popularism, or the popularity of Iran, decreased a lot. But I do believe that the popularism of the Iranian rhetoric is not influencing anymore the public opinion, and therefore Iran is compensating that with political decisions, talking about collective security, for example, talking about the security initiative, Hormuz security initiative, and so on. So this is a copy-paste process of the Helsinki initiative that was adopted beforehand. So Helsinki is something that the Europeans succeeded in doing. However, how can this initiative of Hormuz succeed taking all of the situation into consideration? So I'm talking about the political regime in Iran, and I think that its popularity is really decreasing at the level of the Arab public opinion, and this is being felt a lot because they are trying to really use public diplomacy and to focus on this past reputation. So Iran before the revolution and after the revolution has been a dilemma for Arabs. One of the reasons is because Arabs do not have one unified opinion. One Iranian diplomat once told me, we insist to receive a certain number of reports from every country on Iran. So the problem is the fact that they cannot unify their position, especially at the level of the GCC. So there's no unified position, and there's also another problem. This gives Iran momentum in what it is doing at the political level. So I think that there are two levels of cooperation with Iran. There is the need to have a clear political rhetoric. Actually it succeeded in Oman when Oman said that there is zero intervention from Iran, and this is something that all other countries should adopt. And it's very important to build alliances with countries like Pakistan, like Turkey, in order to feel that the positions are really important and interesting. I don't think that Iran now has the courage. In fact, agreement is like a tool of definition and a rehabilitation tool of the international community, and if any step might be taken, this might take back Iran to an isolated country, to what the situation was before in the past. And since the year 2015, Iran is really trying to get away from this circle, and it will keep on working on not withdrawing, trying really to make things take more and more time. So there are different choices for Iran: buy more time in order to adopt this strategy. This is the strategy that was always adopted by Iran since 40 years ago, in order not to enter into any confrontation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will try and answer some of the questions together. This no war, no peace is the rhetoric and the slogan of Khamenei. This is exactly what he says. And every time Rouhani gives a speech or Zarif sends a tweet that says that sends positive signals towards the United States, Khamenei comes out and says no war, no peace. As Ali mentioned, what we've seen in Iran and what we saw in 2015 was the emergence of a consensus between the different actors over the nuclear agreement. And this is an incredibly fragile consensus, and it often comes under severe strain and stress. This is a consensus within the Iranian body politic that could at any time come apart. And I used to think that the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing within the Iranian state. And I've actually more recently come to believe that it is part of a calculated strategy of good cop, bad cop, that deliberately Khamenei says no war, no peace, at the same time as Rouhani is saying something completely different, and they're sending deliberately these conflicting signals to see which one sticks, and how these signals get picked up and how they get responded to. And I think you're absolutely right. This no war, no peace isn't just between Iran and the United States. We've seen this in relation to, for example, many countries' relationship with Israel, this state of no war, no peace. And you asked about Iranian populism. We saw in Ahmadinejad a throwback to the early days of the revolution, We see in Khatami and Rouhani very different rhetoric. We wait and see what happens in the presidential elections in 2 years' time. So we might, there are these conflicting tendencies. You have revolutions are like riding a bicycle. You have to pedal hard to avoid a nasty fall. So at some level, the political leaders have to keep up this rhetoric of populism. But there's also a deep awareness that they need to deliver services, they need to engage in normal relations with other countries, they need to reduce the level of populism. And we saw that most starkly beginning with Rafsanjani, continuing with Khatami, and now Rouhani. There was a great question, I'm afraid the gentleman left, about what are some of the solutions and what's the coexistence. How do we encourage coexistence, the role of think tanks, academic institutions? Clearly, the current security architecture hasn't worked. The American sanctions regime hasn't worked. The Saudi attempt to join the Americans to bring Iran to its knees hasn't worked. The Emirati attempt to bring Iran to its knees hasn't worked. The past 40 years of security architecture has only brought us insecurity, deepening levels of insecurity. Oftentimes, I want to go to regional policymakers and say, how's that working out for you? It's not working out, and I think we need a different discourse. We need a different conception of the regional order. This country, Iran, is not going away. And somehow, the current perspectives haven't worked. And I think we need to come up with different solutions. So I completely agree that we need to change the rhetoric. Last question, there were two questions that Professor asked. Is the JCPOA dead? I think that's an excellent question. And that's a question that is asked and debated with extreme intensity in Tehran. Because Iran finds, at least as far as Iran is concerned, that it is the only power that is observing by the terms of the nuclear agreement. The Americans have pulled out. The Europeans don't have the courage or the ability to stand up to the Americans. And I think it's a valid question for the Iranians to ask of themselves, do they need to rethink their assumption? The other question was, what's new? In the presence of a prolific scholar like yourself, sir, I have nothing original to say.
That's what I expect. Okay. نبدأ من اليسار تفضل.
So let's start from the right, please. The left, please. Left side. So I would like to thank the speakers once again, and there is a very interesting point that is important. It's related to the situation before the negotiations. Of course, the Iranians were very successful in what concerns the negotiations, and there is the attached file that emanated from the crisis resulting from the fact that Obama's era was going to end, and this is reflected in the nature of the convention. So if, for example, Obama had more time, maybe the conditions of the attached file would have been imposed on the Iranians before the conventions or the agreement. So Trump is a response to the capability by that the US has, and we can also say that if it wants to reimpose things that it not succeed to impose in the past, it might do that. The Americans, of course, have a very big power, and that can be represented by the economic sanctions and blockades that might be imposed in different countries. My name is Elias Khalil.
If I may, I want to ask the question to the panelists, but especially to Dr. Mahjoob. the agreement is about nuclear weapons on the hands of Iran. But to put it in a global perspective, we know that Trump also withdrew from the ICBM treaty with Russia, which was concluded not by Obama, but by Reagan. And the main rationale is that really nuclear weapons are obsolete. What is happening, there's a huge technological innovations in warfare. And that one country could have a precise attack on another country without have this massive destruction like Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the bad publicity that could come up with it. So really, there is a little need to have these nuclear weapons. And the attack on Aramco proves that. You could have very precise attack with minimal death, human destruction, but devastating economic consequence. So really, this nuclear deal is not something important really for Iran. It is really, in the calculation of things, it's really what matters is what really Saudi Arabia and Israel have raised, and that is Iran's capability in having these rockets and the other conventional capability. And so really there is a need for economic containment, political containment. So going back or not going back is a kind of a sideshow because it's not really very important for Iran to have a nuclear weapons if my assumption is correct.
My question is to Professor Mehran. How can what you call the pragmatic states keep balance between their interests with the United States and their interests with the counter-hegemonic states? And why do you see that Jordan is in the category with allied middle power states? Do you think it is moving to especially their Jordanian, Qatari, and Turkey relationship is so strong right now? Thank you.
محمد المنشاوي دكتور مهران ودكتور محمود.
Muhammad Al-Manshawi, I would like to address myself to Dr. Mehran and Dr. Mahmoud. You talked about neither peace and nor war between Tehran and Washington. However, what are the red lines that might lead to direct confrontations between both parties, especially that there are no direct dialogue between Washington and Tehran? What are the circumstances that might lead to a military confrontation between Washington and Tehran?
الملاحظة الأولى فيما يتعلق بما قبل التفاوض.
So first, regarding the period before the negotiation, what President Barack Obama did is that he thought out of the box in what concerns dealing with Iran. For 40 years, there was one box only. So he tried during his administration to think in a creative manner and to think out of the box. At the same time, Iran really was willing to get out of this box, the box that is represented by traditional thinking and that the problem should not be settled. Trump went back into this box when Trump withdrew from the nuclear arrangement. It really went back to this box that was present before the year 2015. So to which extent this situation might be maintained by President Trump, especially taking into consideration that he cannot guarantee that Iran will think the same way or will want to solve this situation. So, of course, he said that he wants a new agreement. So even regarding his narrative, his administration had a certain rhetoric, and I do believe that the issue of attachment is linked to the personal willingness of the president, and I do believe that even Barack Obama had something personal to think of at this level. So agreeing on the nuclear agreement, the agreement is not related to nuclear weapons for Iran. It's related to going back to the international community and to playing a role at the international level to put an end to this bad reputation, and therefore the nuclear program is a tool to reach this objective. And I do believe that the confrontation between Iran and the United States of America is something that is linked to alliances of this country. For example, at a certain period of time, Israel wanted to target all the nuclear locations, Iranian nuclear locations. The Americans said, can you guarantee that this will put an end to the nuclear program? They said no. Then they answered them, then why should we go into a confrontation with them? I think the United States of America do not want to go into war with Iran. Of course, there might be some parties that might be encouraging this. However, I do not believe this. That the administration wants to go into a confrontation with Iran, and I also think that the American administration is looked at as an administration that is weaker than one that really wants to launch a confrontation against Iran.
Thank you. Very quickly, there was an excellent question about the pragmatic states dilemma between Iran and the United States. I think both the Iranians and the Americans are aware of the difficult circumstance the smaller states of the GCC are in. And for example, we hear from the Iranians, they say, well, we understand why Qatar has to be so closely allied with the United States. The Americans say, we understand why Qatar has to maintain trade relations with Iran. So there's some sort of modus vivendi, there's some sort of mutual understanding by the Americans and the Iranians of the very difficult predicament of the GCC states and how they have to navigate the relationship between these two. And of course, it doesn't make it easy for these states, for Oman, Qatar, and Kuwait, but they have navigated it, and it is there. There was this excellent question about Jordan, and is Jordan shifting? As I mentioned, some of these categories are extremely fluid. Jordan is in a particularly tough position because of its economic needs, and it has been adroit, very capable for many decades of navigating its relations. It has often found itself in a very difficult predicament because of Israel and the United States, and of course the domestic politics of the country. So Jordan is now having to navigate its relationship with Saudi Arabia on the one side and its economic relationship, the economic dimensions of that relationship, with its relationship with Qatar and with Turkey. And is it shifting? Is it somewhere in between? We have to wait and see. And then finally, the question about the red lines and the circumstances that might actually end up in a conflict. Some time ago, I was talking to people at the American base here, and the big fear there was some accidental occurrence, some accidental war. It wasn't so much that the Iranians would swarm or the Americans would attack, but somehow there would be some mishap, and this mishap would result in escalation. I do think if the Iranians were to hit Israeli interests in the Golan Heights, that would be a red line for the Americans. So if we're talking about actual red lines, we know Iranian forces are in Syria. We know they're quite active. And one of the interesting things is every time Israel attacks IRGC forces to provoke a reaction, the Iranians don't react. So far, they haven't played into that. But I think that would definitely be a red line.
Thank you. Just first a footnote to the prisoner. So it was actually a prisoner swap. It was not a unilateral measure. I just checked on Twitter as well. And so there was, so the Iranians got one national released in exchange for that PhD student from Princeton. Let me just add to what I've said earlier. In terms, I don't know what was behind it. Let me just add to what I said earlier about the success of Iran's offensive strategy. And obviously there are some very sincere inherent risks of that strategy. One is if Iran continues up to, in terms of its reducing commitments of the under the JCPOA, if it decides to withdraw from the JCPOA or eventually even from the NPT, this might be a game changer in the sense that it might really shift the discourse and the discussion in Europe. So we'll see a revitalization of the Iran nuclear crisis during the Bush era, and Israel coming into the scene, and so this will create a new dynamic that might be very prone to military escalation. The other aspect is that for Iran to keep on amassing leverage in view of possible talks with the United States. So there are a lot of people who fear that we're going to see a new series of escalatory measures by Iran. I think the CENTCOM commander said that at the Manama dialogue in Bahrain. So this, of course, in itself, as Kamran said, so those mishaps, if they would involve some human casualties, there is also a serious threat of escalation. So it's a very risky strategy of the Iranians, although it has been quite successful so far in signaling and demonstrating to the other side how large the cost of war would be. And it also has led to some kind of rethinking in the hawkish stances of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates vis-a-vis Iran. So, which might be an opening to some kind of a mini arrangement between the two sides. Another aspect that is complicating the situation is the regional protests in Lebanon, most notably in Iraq, but also the domestic protests in Iran. So, because this is also quite unprecedented regionally in terms of Iranian soft power that Mahjoob has alluded to, that has suffered a lot. The strategic depth might be a jeopardy, with Iraq obviously being the prime location thereof. And so this is an immense challenge for the Iranians, and I'm not sure how they can solve that. And also domestically, the situation is very, very tense. So all of that, so there are immense challenges that might see some kind of a, different balance of power within Iranian domestic forces now with, the RGC maybe, gaining more foothold on the political scene, and with Rouhani being, pushed aside somehow. So we might see a more hardline, viewpoint from Tehran. But there are, so there are a lot of factors that play into this very volatile situation. Thank you.
شكرا دكتور علي وشكرا لكم جميعا.
Thank you all. I would like to apologize because we started the session late and we ended it late. Needless to say, the speakers have shared interesting presentations. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for your participation.